Managing a game dev studio isn't easy. There's a lot of moving parts and you need to do a lot of different things. You need to make code, you need to make models, you need to manage, if you have a team of multiple people, you need to manage those people, you have maybe music, all of those things. It can get very complicated sometimes to find the right things or to have the right piece of information when you need it, and it can cost you a lot of time. We've definitely had our fair share of struggles over the past 18 months trying to make our own game. But I think by now we're starting to figure out a bit, how do we manage our projects? How do we manage everything? So that's really what I want to go over in this video. I want to talk a bit more about what are the structures that we use for managing our code, for managing our to-do lists, or basically how we make our games, managing our documentation, and how we manage our people. I think those are the four main categories of management that you need to get good at if you're a game developer. People, maybe if you're a solo developer, not as much, but once you're with two people or more, that's also a very important thing to manage that a lot of developers overlook. Now, why manage? Well, this one should go pretty much without saying, because if you've been making a game for a while now and suddenly you're noticing that, oh, how do I do this one thing again? Or, oh, I had an idea for this, but did I ever write it down? Or maybe even you're just looking at an old piece of code and you're just thinking to yourself like, man, the person who wrote this code was such an utter idiot. Well, spoiler alert, you're probably the one who wrote that code. And that's generally not the best thing to happen to you. So this is where putting in structures into your game dev routine and managing everything comes in handy. Now what we have is not going to be a one-size-fits-all, so I really encourage you to go down in the description below and also say what are your quick tips or what are your hacks that you do or your structures to help maybe some other developers who are also looking for inspiration, because, well, everyone works a bit differently, but this is what works great for us. The first thing that I think you should put the most time into managing is actually your to-do list or your issue tracking. Basically, how do you know what you're gonna be working on? That's the most important thing. And for us, we have one really main system we use for this, and that is called a Kanban board. I've talked about it a while before. We use GitLab because GitLab is our code repository as well. We'll jump into that in a second, but it also allows you to, for each project, have a Kanban board where you can do issue tracking is what it's called. So you create issues, which are little cards that say that, oh, I need to implement this thing or this needs to be done. And then you can track it. It has columns of this is in my backlog. I'll do this at a later point, but it's not a priority. This is something that we need to work on now. This is what someone is working on and this is what has been completed. And you can add a whole bunch of extra columns. We, for example, also have a column dedicated for bugs, and every ticket is basically a to-do item. And this is really great to track the general progress of your game. Our Game Forge industry consists of about 1,700 of those little individual issues, and it makes it a lot more chewable to make a game. Instead of just being like, oh, I need to finish my game today, or I need to continue working on my game today, you can look at, okay, what is my specific task going to be? Because if you don't really know what you're going on and you're just going to jump into your editor and I'll figure out what I'm gonna do, maybe I'll polish up this or that. If you don't have a plan, you're just gonna waste time and you're not really gonna make that much progress. Whereas if you're like, today I'm going to implement the serialization of our safe load system for this new building that we've implemented, but we can't save worlds with it yet. That's much more concrete. You have an actionable thing and generally it won't take that long. Speaking of long, it's not that easy to make those issues sometimes because, well, how big should an issue be? Should I make an issue for adding a label to some UI element, or should I add an issue just for add pod finding, things like that? Generally, what I suggest you to do is to have, when you create one of those issues or tasks, basically is imagine it takes about 1 to 2 hours. It can take longer, but generally, if you're like, oh, I could do this in an hour or two, doesn't mean you actually have to do it in an hour or two. That's probably what I could call the right size. Of course, you can also look into SMART, which is specific, measurable, actionable, there's the whole goal framework. But generally, use your common sense. How long does it take? And that's what we found out is about the best granularity. Because otherwise you're creating too much overhead with, oh, I need to make all of these different issues and things like that. And you don't have to make these issue boards just for your game. You can make them for your company as well. So then you use it also a bit as a to-do list. So we have an issue board for our game itself, or well, for each of our games at this point. And then we also track like what do we need to do company-wise. For example, we need to file some tech stuff, or I need to contact someone to reach out for a possible collab, things like that. Those you also track so you know what's going on and such. One cool thing that GitLab has, and I think a lot of the other Kanban solutions also have it if you're with multiple people, is that I can get assigned to a task. So you can see also, if you look at like the column of what's currently going on, who's working on what, so you keep in the loop, and you also can like assign issues in advance. So for example, if I make something that I know that only Thomas can do, or that I want Thomas to do, I create the ticket for him and I assign him, and then he gets an email that like, hey, there's new work for you, here's your issue. Next up is how we manage our documentation. And I think this is the one where we weren't really good at. And I still think we have a lot to improve upon this, but we've already learned a lot. So how we documented our Game Forge industry? Well, for the longest period of time, we just had a game design document that I wrote. It was like 13 pages long. I wrote this before we started working on the game, even before we coded a single line. And we used that for about half a year. And then anytime something wasn't really clear, they would just come to me, one of the developers, and be like, Marnix, what do you want me to do here? And then I had to go and I think back what was my vision and such. But this is not great, especially if you have more than one person who's like truly putting his vision and like has the gameplay ideas and such thought out and has to align with other people. Don't do like that. What we then did is we switched to OneNote, and in OneNote we started making pages for like certain mechanics. This was when, for example, we were working on our harbor. We were like expanding the game with some new like mechanics. We made like a page for the harbor where I explained the main purpose of the harbor, and then like, oh, this is how I want marriage to work. This is how I want, for example, our like faction requests to work. And I wrote it all down in detail, or like material research as well. And this already allowed like people to see it a bit more. But what I then did was I was also like, everybody, look at this, read this through and give me your questions so we can document like all of the problems now instead of them like coming up once you're actually implementing it. OneNote in general, I don't really suggest at all though, because why did we take it? I don't even know really why we used it. Probably because we were just all on like Office 365 and we could like easily share it, but I think there are plenty of better solutions to manage it. I think Notion is the one that comes to mind the most because it has a really good system of nesting and linking things to each other and like dynamic elements such as adding tables and stuff or adding pictures. That's, I think, the best. We don't use Notion. I'll tell you that, but if I could, I would. But there's this thing called technical debt where it would also just cost us a lot of time to move everything over, and then I would need to learn William, Thomas and Jamie, because none of them have worked with Notion, how it works and get it all. It's all a bit of a mess. What we do use is we use Microsoft Loop, which is basically Microsoft's alternative to Notion. It's free right now, but it's still very early in beta. So it's not really that advanced. It does look prettier than OneNote, and for basically moving from OneNote to Loop, I didn't really have many problems. It has better support for tables, but it's still nowhere near as good as Notion. But I had no learning curve getting it to the rest of the team, so they knew how to use it. What we're also trying out now is an internal wiki where we're going to dump like all of the static information. So things that aren't really like changing often. So also, for example, documentation of how do our like custom internal tools work for working with Unity a bit more efficient and like importing certain things. We're trying to put it more on there. The problem we have there, of course, is I need to always run after Thomas and such to document what they're doing. So still not perfect there, but I do think we have some progress there. And then the big one, managing our code. So we've made a video about it before. We use Git, and as I just said before, we use Git hosted on a GitLab server that we manage ourselves, which gives us, for example, those issue boards. What we do is we have one big repository for a game. That's the logic one. But then we also, for every game, we have a separate repository just for the assets and the art and things like that. Because we don't want to have our project files alongside with like the actual game, because it's a lot of bloat, and our game was already way too large, like repository size wise. And in this like assets repository is usually what we call it. We store the things like, for example, our 2D art, our 3D models, we store our sound files in it. And whilst Git isn't, the best thing because you can't track like byte changes really, it's still a very good way to collaborate with each other because I can just pull my changes. There's never any conflicts really of like two people doing the same thing at the same time. And if it is, well, then Git will resolve it for you or you get to resolve it yourself. But I do think that's a better approach. Then apart from just the asset repositories, we also have a OneDrive. And on the OneDrive, it's basically a shrunk down version of the assets repository. We have a similar structure. Everything that has a repository for our logos and such, for example, we also dump on OneDrive for like the most common things. So for example, our logos or like screenshots of our games, we put all of those things on OneDrive as well, so we can very easily see it. Also stuff like documents, or even for me, like the accounting part, I put on OneDrive as well to manage that, because I kind of think that's also like a project. It's just not a game like project, but it's like keeping the business alive project, and I store it all of there. And then the last thing that is probably the most important to manage is your people, because I need to know what everyone else of the team is doing, and I like to see myself a bit as a producer here as well, to keep everyone in touch and to make sure if someone is having a problem to help them as fast as possible. Maybe I can't help them directly, but I can put them in touch with one of the other people who does know how to solve, and they can get to work again faster. And there's a few ways we do this. So for context, I come from a very corporate world, but I think that they do something really well, and that's one-on-ones, and have one-on-ones as much as possible. Especially if you're like us, we don't have a physical office really where we all come together and work from. We need to constantly be in touch with each other. And we do that generally through chat with like Discord, where we constantly send messages of like, hey, this is broken, or we have like different channels for like reporting bugs, for talking about our projects, talking about Bite Me games in general, or like planning our events. But there's this something about talking to someone, actually speaking words, having your camera on, looking them in the eyes, well, looking at your screen, but looking them in the eyes and saying what's going on. It's much better than just sending a message of like, oh man, this sucks so much. Well, you'll miss like so much context suddenly because you can't see how the other person is acting. In person would still always be better, but it's more harder to do logistically, also especially if you don't live like very close to each other. But do those one-on-ones every week. Have a like sit down point, and also what's more important, I think, is prepare for those one-on-ones. What I do is, and I wish that the rest of the team did this a bit more as well, is I make a list. Like I have like in my Loop, because we use Loop for managing this stuff, I make a page for every single one-on-one. And in the one-on-one, there's 3 main topics. I talk about what do I want to discuss. So this is something that builds up during the week. And these are things that aren't really crucial enough that I need an answer now, but I do need an answer. So for example, we talk about, well, one of the examples is we're going to like an event in October, but I still needed like some confirmation on it. It's no like biggie, but it needs to be done. Or I talk about what has been going on with like another team member over the past week and like how he's feeling, stuff like that, if it's more of a management one-on-one. But I always have a list of talking points. And that way it prevents you from both people joining the call and then being like, oh, what's going on? And it's like, well, it's been going good, I guess. I've been working. That's not how like one-on-one should be. You should be like having actively talking points, and once you run out of talking points, just call the one-on-one done. Don't waste any extra time with like small talk. Prepare your one-on-ones, and also then during the one-on-one, take notes of what's being said. Or don't type down like everything that's being said, but talk about what were the main topics we discussed again. So this causes you to pay a bit of attention, and also you can look back in time to be like, oh yeah, that's right, we did discuss this at some point. And also very important, write down actionable points right when they are being said. So for example, Thomas was like, oh yeah, we should go to this event. Can you send the promo art to like the company? I immediately make a note to send that art, and then it's like a checklist, and I can just check those things off. Or it's something like, oh, we needed to get an extra license for like our IDE that we use. Make an extra check mark to actually go and get that license. Not things you do during the one-on-one. You should just be talking to the other person mostly, but things you should follow up on. And then also we do a like once a week, because as I said, we're not like physically together all the time. We have some people who are doing this part-time. We set about like, we always plan for an hour, but usually it gets more like 1.5 or even 2 hours, where the entire team gets together and we just talk about like that week. We update each other. And also, similar to the 101, bring topics. Don't go in blind and just be like, oh yeah, I guess I did this. You're losing a lot of time there that you just can't afford to lose really, and you could be having a lot better conversations. You can do them more often as well. Honestly, I think sometimes we could do 101s twice a week, but we haven't gotten around to it. And it depends a bit also. You just have to feel these things and learn a bit more about it. And yeah, I think that's the main structures that we use. We're not that like rigid. We don't have like solid like file templates and all of those things. But I think that these are some great starting points to bring a bit more structure into your like studio and be sure that what you're working on will actually lead to something and it's not just, you know, oh, let's make a game, but then never reaching anything. So yeah, that's all I really had to say. If you're new here, we're a game development studio, as you may have noticed, and we make videos like these where we talk about our own experience. How is it to go from absolutely zero, no like game dev education, to starting our own studio? We released our first game. Now we're working on our second game, and we make these videos twice a week where we talk about like game dev advice like this. Also, we talk about like, for example, game design topics, or we talk about the financials, or we talk about the progress on our own games, or even if we go to like an event, like for example, we're planning on going to Gamescom in a few weeks. We're gonna bring you guys along as well and talk about some of the Gamescom things as well, do a little vlog here and there. So if that's something that interests you, be sure to go ahead down below and give us a like and also maybe subscribe, as it really helps us out. And as I said, you get this cool content twice a week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.